All I can say is that you have just touched the surface of the entire book, which kind of goes far deeper into just the narrative history. It goes into the very ethos of those times, and you can really things which were unseen all these years about what actually made the background of the Mughal period and how the Mughal emperors actually governed, what kind of led them, the role of women, which was quite a prominent one, the way decisions were taken, and it's a big journey. The book is a big journey, and I'm surprised that you could fit it into 200 odd pages, because even what you described just now, I think if you really had to write it all down, it would have probably been double its size, because there's so much which is unstated in the book.
Can you speak a little louder?
There's so much that is unstated in the book, and which it's only while reading that you draw conclusions as you kind of read it, what all has been happening there. So you have mentioned Scheherazade in one of the places in the book, and I would say that this is the 1002nd night of the Arabian Nights. We see what the entire kaleidoscope of Gulbadan's journey has been. I'm not familiar with this personality of Gulbadan, nor was I very familiar, except for very broad outlines of what that Mughal period, the history was. So it was all a revelation for me as I went through those books. Now, it's very interesting that a solitary copy of that book, and as you speculated towards the end of the book, that was it because of some kind of censorship, that some things which she wrote was not for public consumption. So I'll come to it a little later. But I find that from 1997, you first began your work on Gulbadan till 2023. You have been with Gulbadan for 26 years. And I would only call it a magnificent obsession with that lady. So I feel that this is a very long time. Like when you say in your book, when you hold a manuscript from the British Library, is this her handwriting? Did she touch these pages? I mean, that kind of writing is something which really takes you close to the person, makes you imagine what kind of a person is writing that book, and therefore gives you a third dimension to just a book that is you're holding. Actually, I was in a PDF actually, but which is not the same thing as holding a paper book. So this kind of impressions were there. Then the note in the end, which I read somewhere in the middle of the book, was very intriguing, and you addressed it in the beginning of your talk today. But I'd like to ask you something more about it. So you said that because the manuscript was not complete in itself, and of course a lot of gaps had to be filled in with either from the Babarnama or from the Akbarnama and other writers of that time. And you labelled quite a new word which I heard for the first time, which is reassembled history. Because we have heard of original letters as sources of history, we have heard of pakhars, which are subjective accounts of history, but the gaps remain. And here if I start telling somebody about something which may have happened in that gap, it is considered to be oral history, and therefore it is brought down to such a low level that it is not worth reporting. So I would request you to give a little bit more about the reassembled history that you say, and of course the fundamental male disbelief, which you will not find in me, but which you again addressed in your note. So I think let's start with the end of the book with these two terms: fundamental male disbelief and the reassembled history.
Okay. So thank you so much. My publicist, of course, sent Dr. Kulkarni, the draft. It was still not finally edited. So thank you for reading, and those are lovely reactions. And those two questions are very, very significant. So, male disbelief. It's a way in which I make sense of what I do. And here, of course, you're absolutely right. Male belief does not mean only men are doing this. Right? That is not the idea. But you use male in the sense of people with power. The issue is power and non-power people, right? That's what you're talking about. Who has been writing history always, right? Why have other forms of history not been recognized? So I'll give you a very different kind of example, which is in the 70s and 80s, when people started writing women-oriented books, they were classified as supplemental history, that is add-on. Or if you wrote a book, right, and you added a chapter on women, right, people thought they were doing this kind of great feminist history. In fact, I'll tell you another lovely story, which is lovely and very disturbing actually. My first job in Johns Hopkins, and I'm hired as a professor of history and also supposed to run the Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies program. So I was waiting, trying to buy a cup of coffee in this lovely August setting of the Gilman Hall, which is where the history department was. And a colleague of mine in the department was behind me. I won't name him. He was a Spanish historian. And so he welcomed me very warmly and he said, "This is lovely, it's so great you're here," etc. And he said, "But tell me one thing. Why do we need a department of women, gender and sexuality studies? I have a chapter on women in my book," right? That's what I'm talking about. Having a chapter does not mean, right? It is not integral to our ways of being. And there are really, I mean, I'll be candid, I think these are insidious ways in which we marginalize these texts. So Gulbadan's text, for instance, and absolutely right, I love Magnificent Obsession. I'm so happy to have a Magnificent Obsession. I mean, people classify it as a book of soft society. I've given you the range of things that are covered in that memoir, right? From women's bartering, children dying in war, incredible negotiation. I mean, the Battle of Chausa that I mentioned, right?
We want to come to that.
Battle of Chausa was...
Even the story of Khanzada.
And Khanzada Begum, the aunt of Gulbadan, who was bartered by her own brother, Humayun, right? So that he could have a safe exit from Samarkand, right? And Gulbadan then writes about this. So to classify, I'm talking about modern historians, not what Akbar does. But to classify that book as a book of soft society, or when Annette Beveridge did the first English translation of this book to one of the publishers in England, called it, it's a little book, it's but a little book, right? So those almost kind of damned way at looking at these texts or damned way at looking at poetry, you know, people say, so in the case of Noor Jahan, just to give you a parallel example, there's a wonderful manuscript in Aligarh called Fatnama-e-Noor Jahan Begum, basically the chronicle of the victory of Noor Jahan. And this is a 100-page masnavi on a penultimate act in which Noor Jahan actually goes to war to save Jahangir from a 100-day captivity, right? And it's been classified as a panegyric. Now, I want to ask people, why is Akbarnama not panegyric? I mean, Abul Fazl, what does he do? He's just, you know, ringing praises of he's basically, you know, but this is part of, this is not a battle between men and women. This is part of a courtly culture. This is a part of how a source is assembled. So actually, that's what I mean. You know, how you practice, and women are very complicit in this kind of you know, evasion of not thinking. So it's I'm using the traditional power people to think, to conceptualize my own journey with sources, if that makes sense. And the second question, this one was about male disbelief. The second, what you call filling, reassembling. I actually think what most of us do is actually one way or another reassembling, right? We take documents, of course, I mean, one of the things as a Mughal, as a trained textualist, right? I had also been complicit in thinking Mughal art as, I mean, it was glorious. It is glorious, right? But I learned that in order to use Mughal art as a source base, you had to really study its iconography, right? These are not just beautiful pictures that should be of course they should be inserted into books, and they are beautiful pictures, but they come with so much meaning. And I spent really quite extended periods studying Mughal art with some very fine Mughal art historians. So when we use the visual material, when we use the textual material, what else are we doing? I mean, I think we would be pretending if we didn't think that we were not assembling data, that we were not assembling things in the ways in which we want to make sense of you know, the story that obsesses us.
Coming back to the narrative part of Gulbadan was born in the year 1523, and she came to India around 1528 in the Kafila, which came from Kabul to Delhi and then came to Agra, which was that time the Mughal capital where her father Babur was staying. And she probably saw her father for about 7 years of her life. And when she writes the book much later, where probably in her 50s, she remembers the events that happened in those 7 years. And several things which she writes about, like in Kabul, she is talking about shared children and shared husbands. Now, would you say that that was a kind of a tribal society from where the Mughals came and then they became more settled and they developed an imperial kind of a...
Yeah, I think, so this is a really interesting question that I thought about a lot during my first book. Basically, the time we are looking at, and this is not just, Afghanistan, Central Asia, Northern India, I think much of the world has been structured and made by movement and migration, royalty or non-royalty. Except that the adab or the ethics or the etiquette or the way in which royalty lived from the ordinary people was extremely different. So I think all of those ethics, were very much in place. What they had in Afghanistan and so on is what I would call the steppe culture. I mean, which is why women were so much more visible, which is why there was so much, on the outside, participating in various kinds of outdoor activities and so on and so forth. And this settlement and segregation and so on, as I've charted, actually begins to take place with Akbar as part of this institutionalization that I was talking about. And I think this is the discomfort, if you imagine her character of this woman who's being born and raised at let's say in her late 40s, now suddenly she's being told you have to live in the haram. It's a holy space, is a very significant thing in history. And I think it's because of that she goes to the Hijaz, if you ask me.
I'm going to come to that.
Yeah.
Now, at the 7-year-old girl, she sees the death of her father. Before that, she sees Humayun being brought to Agra in a very, almost as if he's going to die. All the physicians say that nothing much can be done. You just have to pray to God. Then Babur goes and then he's told that you must make a sacrifice to what you hold to be most valuable. Tell something about that story, because that is really interesting. In Gulbadan's words, actually.
Yes. It would be hard to replicate her words, but this is the one place where we hear the story of sacrifice, that Humayun, Babur's son, Babur is the first king, Humayun, his son. Babur wasn't persuaded that he should be the heir to the throne, but one thing led to another, and he was meant to be. And then he becomes severely ill, to the point that he could die. And then Babur, they call the physicians and do all sorts of things, but he doesn't get better. And then Babur gathers together his noblemen and he says that I will give my life in exchange for this for my son. And so everybody says to him, there's a very important sage, Abul Baka, he says to him, he says, look, you can do this in exchange for a precious gift. You don't have to give your life. Humayun has the Kohinoor, he says. Why don't we take the Kohinoor and we can, sell it or whatever, distribute it. And Babur says, there is nothing more precious to me than my son. So they agree. And actually, Gulbadan records this whole ritual of, Babur starts fasting and, going around the bed of his son, basically just praying and offering his life. And on the second or third day, Humayun starts rising and Babur starts, of course he dies 3 months later.
And he says that this is the most valuable thing I can offer
my son.
More than the Kohinoor, my own life.
Yes. And so soft society.
Now again, when you come to the Battle of Chausa, which you mentioned in passing, when he takes his women folk all the way in the campaign down the Ganges to Bengal to fight Sher Shah. And there is a lot of criticism in later history of carrying your women to the battlefield, like in the third battle of Panipat. Every time I give a talk on that, is criticism, why did you take your women from there? So this is not a new practice, it's been going on for a long time. And he loses his queen to Sher Shah, who captures her, keeps her in captivity for some time, and then sends her back to Agra.
That's right, Begum.
Yes. So that's a very interesting insight into the way they led their campaigns. Probably they felt they were strong enough to protect them, but sometimes things can go the other way. Now another very interesting story I would like you to tell our audience is the way Hamida Begum and Hamida Banu Begum negotiates her marriage with Humayun.
Yes, and the only place in which
when he's on his wanderings in Sindh, that is where he meets her, and she like an equal negotiates her wedding with him. So I would like you to say.
So Hamida Banu was the mother of Akbar and wife of Humayun, and when Humayun is in exile in Sindh, he loses his territory to Sher Shah and goes into exile in Sindh. And in part in Sindh, he gets there, and his younger brother, half brother, Hindal, is there along with Dildar, his stepmother. And that's where he sees the 14-year-old Hamida, and he's of course besotted by her, and he wants to marry her. And so he sends one, message after another, asking her to come. And so she says at one point, if it is to pay my, so there is a feast at which he meets her. And so she says, if it was to pay my respects the other day, I have done it already. A second time is forbidden. So then he talks to Dildar, and he talks to Hindal. He's just absolutely in love, and he wants to marry her, all that kind of stuff. She is not relenting. So Dildar finally, she was the daughter of the progenitor of Hindal, so the family was known, right? She came from a very important saintly family. And so Dildar says to Hamida, she says, well, one day you will marry someone who is better than a king. So she says to Dildar, I will marry a man whose collar my hand can reach, not whose skirt I cannot touch. So this is an allegory to the man who was in exile, who could not maintain her, who was 14 or 15 years older than her. So there's this very serious negotiation that takes place. Eventually they marry, of course. And Hamida and Gulbadan become very close friends. And so this again is a story that comes in. So this extraordinary window into women's negotiation that you find in
the early Mughal period, you find the treatment given to those who are either traitors, offenders, who have kind of acted against the sovereign, which you find in Babur's time. Like you find that Ibrahim Khan Lodi's mother was forgiven and allowed to stay in the palace with, and then she poisons Babur afterwards. Or, for example, when Kamran opposes Humayun, not once but more than once, he is kind of forgiving in his attitude towards Kamran until finally his courtiers kind of push him that way and he blinds him and so on.
And
so
that's where the manuscript breaks off, actually.
That is where she, mid-sentence it breaks off. That when Kamran is blinded, that's where the manuscript ends. But this, do you feel like this, these early Mughals were a little softer towards, or was it Humayun's nature to be that way? Because later you find immediately all succession wars, unless you wipe out the rest of the brothers, you can't become the king.
Yes. I think from Humayun on this starts, right? I mean, it's pretty ferocious, the internecine battle, primarily because there was no law of primogeniture, by which it means that the oldest son could not succeed. And this has been part of the imperial politics in, whether you take Safavid Iran or you take Ottoman Turkey, so very much part of the but also kind of establishing yourself as a serious contender. So not only battling with your brothers, but also what your networks are, who are the courtiers on your side, and of course reading the khutbah, almost always rising in rebellion against your father. So that was
you have described Humayun's loss at Chausa, the battle at near Kannauj, and then he goes on he's on exile to Persia finally because the brothers were not willing to help him. And then when he comes back, he regains Delhi, comes back to Agra, and then he calls everybody to come and join him at Fatehpur Sikri, which he has built. And the high walls of the harem, which he builds, behind which the Vagabond Princess is kind of forced to live and everything is restricted. And Akbar is a man who wants to show that these are his, what is exactly what he says? These are his kind of the women of the ruler are kind of not for everybody to see.
Yes.
So he keeps them secluded, which is not something which Gulbadan was ever, familiar with that kind of treatment. So can you give a few back? I mean, that's what finally, as you speculated, probably leads to the Hajj. Although I feel that Akbar also had a motive in sending of
Absolutely.
the Hajj.
Absolutely.
So can you expand?
So actually, Vagabond Princess begins with this. This is the opening scene in which she's sitting across from him, and having this conversation.
We have a gap of 20 years in between 1556 and
Yes.
1576 when she goes and
That's
asks
right.
Akbar permission to.
That's right. So this negotiation, and both of them have an agenda. I mean, let's not assume that she doesn't have an agenda. I think they both have an agenda. So are we going to tell them about all the chapters? Then they won't read the book.
Leave it here. Yeah, I'm just going to. Then we come to the journey. The Hajj is permitted by Akbar. They go to Surat. The transactions in Surat to get the
The
cartes.
Portuguese,
The
yes.
importance of cartes. It was only available for Christians and for Europeans.
Yes.
And Muslims and others were not allowed the cartes. They had to pay something.
Yes.
So how Gulbadan gets around that problem?
Yes.
Then the travel journey to Jeddah.
Mhm.
Jeddah, which is basically it's the Eve's tomb, Adam and Eve.
Yes.
Eve's tomb is what
That's
is
right.
Jeddah. So the appearance in Jeddah, the way she carries herself there. Maybe you can say a few things about the Mahabharata. It sounds more like a Republic Day parade.
The Mahamad. So as I said, that I had to imagine, how were they traveling? What was happening? Of course, we have to remember that they were imperial guests. They were guests of the Ottoman Sultan. So they would have yol omri. This is in Ottoman Turkish. It was like a pass, and they would be protected and guided and so on and so forth. There's one chronicler called. His book is called Tabqat-e Akbari, in which Nizamuddin Ahmad, in which he says that the procession, this procession that went in Western Arabia, this would have looked like the procession of Damascus and of Egypt. Now these were the two really significant, historically significant and very beautiful processions to Mecca and Medina. And one of the key features, this has been documented from the 15th century into the 19th century. There are images and photographs, and lots of people watched them. And I saw some of the really fantastic Ottoman representations of these processions that were taking place. The key to the procession, as it went, whether it went from Damascus or it went from Cairo into Mecca and Medina, at the center of it was a lovely feminine-like structure, like a tent. It was called the Mahamal, and basically it was, if you can imagine a tent, but if you saw it, it looked like a woman covered and sitting. And these were beautiful life-size tents actually. Red, the Abbasids used yellow, at some point it was also red, it was also black. And so, of course, Nizamuddin Ahmad says there was no Mahamal in the Mughal case. And so I imagined how the caravan would have moved from Jeddah into Mecca and Medina. And of course, women would have to be protected. They would travel in the center, right? And then it would be structured exactly like the other caravans. So I made a comparison in my mind of the cluster of the Haraman as the Mahamal. Dr. Kulkarni, I think, was wanting me to say that at the center, because it is a feminine tradition, right? One that they will have definitely known.
Again, the description you have given of Mecca and the areas around the Grand Mosque, and Indians are considered, were near that, Murad considered them to be dirty, and he said they must be banished outside to the outskirts of the town. These are all very interesting kind of tidbits you find here. This is another very important point, small point which you mentioned. The Ghazal was born in Mecca.
Yes.
So we talk about the Lucknowi Ghazal and so on, but this is a new information for me, the Lucknow. But the Ghazal was born in Mecca. That's where it spread to the rest of the world. And of course, the politics of Murad and Akbar are very intriguing.
Yes.
Because in Mughal Azam, for example, you find Akbar is called Zille-Ilahi, the shadow of God, which is something which was exclusively reserved for Murad.
That's right.
And
That's right.
Akbar was calling himself that. So there was, you can see direct confrontation between these two.
Yes.
And I think you brought it out very well in your chapter, in your stay in what actually made it now Meshru was at the base of this was not her behavior. It was probably the conflict between Akbar and Murad.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
Which is why the Mughal documents were silent.
So I would not give you more, give away more of the book, but I would definitely want you to show that picture of nursing which I saw on the slideshow, where they show Humayun sitting at the center,
Yes.
and there's one lady there who draws your attention.
Yes.
And I think with that I like
It's
my
okay. And we should take some questions.
Yes.
Yes.
I think we've switched off the technology. But this is the image in the British Library. So again, speaking of male disbelief, actually this is a really good example. This is an extraordinary image from Gulbadan's time. And from the memoir, this is actually showing Humayun and Hamida's wedding that we were discussing. It's an exquisite image, and the people were drawn. So usually, I mean not always, but many times, many painters collaborated to create a Mughal miniature. And in this case, there was a man called Narsingh who was extremely renowned for drawing individual personalities, even if they were stylized. And so he draws on the periphery of this image a woman holding her book, and it's a red book. So I pondered the question towards the end, who else could it be? Because of course, you know, the British Library had a little statement saying, this could be Gulbadan, right? This may be Gulbadan. We do not know who she is. Now you have to think historically, who else? There's no other woman, right? And so then I studied the iconography of who are the people who've been depicted as shown with books or with bound manuscript, right? I consulted a whole range of art historians on this. It's an exquisite image. I'm sorry that we've closed this, but it is in the book, so you'll get to see it. But I'd love to take some questions and have a chat with you.
Just a question, Ruby. Akbar was, he used to take historians, storytellers with him because he couldn't read apparently.
That's right.
And but how did Gulbadan then learn to read and write
So are you suggesting that because the emperor could not read and write?
No, I'm just asking. Did they, teach women? He never.
Oh yes, it was very extensive. It was in the tradition to learn any number of things. Of course, classically people think it's just learning the Quran, but it's also Persian poetry, it's polo. At the heart of the 1001 Nights, at the heart was storytelling, right? That was one of the ways in which. But also, I documented that there were any number of women who actually wrote theological commentaries way before Gulbadan. So really walking into very male territory. So these were extremely learned women. Hamida Bano was. She had some of they are in Doha at the moment in a collection. She had some of the finest illustrations of the Ramayana done. It's called the Hamida Bano Begum's Ramayana, right? Absolutely exquisite illustrations. Of course, same time as her son was having these illustrations done, but hers are so much more intimate. They are so much more. Attaching to the story rather than just the victory, rather than just the kind of wars and so on and so forth. So there is that interest. There's been some question and thinking around. So Abul Hassan's father, Akariza, who came with Humayun from Persia, he trained Abul Hassan, of course, and any number of other artists, including. We don't know enough about her, but a woman painter known as Nadira Banu.
Okay.
There's been some thought on Mughal artists. So yes, absolutely. Yeah, Meenakshi. Sorry.
I forgot to mention about Hanuman. we'll leave it for the book.
Okay, the Aiden story. Okay.
Sure. As always, a pleasure meeting you, Ruby. Question is, Gulbadan Bagno was quite the non-conformist, way ahead of her time. Can you touch about, no Hajj is complete with a woman, for a woman without going with a maharam.
Yeah.
You talk about the maharam that she took along with her. You haven't,
Yeah,
discussed that.
they were women, so they were men.
They were
right?
men, right? But
One, absolutely, one was Akbar's uncle, right?
The maharam.
And then there was, he was related, a man called Baki Khan, who also knew Turkish. He was there. And then, of course, the Mere Hajj, right? On both ends. And then there would be any number of attendants and other people, but you definitely had to
Have the maharam before the Hajj. Yeah.
When you mention Akbar's agenda in having her go, was it to thumb his nose at Murad?
No, not as that. In terms of his regal aspirations, right? I mean, any number of Muslim monarchs, but also important saints, rebellious thinkers, they had been talking about their being as the millennial sovereign. The millennial was coming. And part of being the millennial sovereign was that you had to be seen as an important and generous person
Maybe
who also
progressive at
followed,
that time.
right?
Yeah.
So this suited him very much. I mean, this was part of his
Sending
imperial
him off
ambition.
it.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
This is probably a bit crazy, but I always feel money and power go together. And it fascinates me that a lot of Mughal women had their own sources, including their own ships, and
Their own
negotiated
income,
their own,
yes.
own deals. So Gulbadan was away for 4 years, or whatever it is. How was the money coming to her? Was it, how was it, she possibly couldn't have taken all the money she needed with her.
Yeah.
So was it coming to caravans? Was it her own money? Because, or was she dependent? Because if a woman becomes dependent for money, then she has no power.
This is, I would say that the idea of ownership of money is a very modern idea,
But-
right?
But women, for example, Jahan, she had her own money when she,
Yeah.
with which, and she had her own ships, and with which she built mosques in Delhi and had charities.
Yeah.
Nur Jahan had her own charities.
Yeah.
So at that time, when the Mughal women were even more independent, because before Akbar put this up and she resented it, and there are quite a few references where Gulbadan people speculate that she was probably A, too rebellious, B, because she and Akbar didn't get along at all. They didn't really like each other. They just tolerated each other. So she was sent. She wanted to walk away from this confinement.
I won't put it in such brass terms. I mean, the important
Yeah,
thing
well,
to-
probably I'm just probably using much stronger terms.
No,
but
that's
there are
fine.
always many undercurrents where things are not said but understood.
Let me just try to respond to both of those things. So the important thing in writing a biography of an earlier time is to begin to understand exactly these questions. But what does it mean to own property, for instance, right? Of course, we were just talking about Surat, from where she takes the ship. There were two jahaz that go together, and it was assumed when Akbar sent her the whole kafila from Fatehpur Sikri to Surat that everything was ready, including an important document called the cartas that the Portuguese were supposed to issue. When she reached there, there was no cartas, right? Speaking of power. And then I came across one reference in Father Monserrate's commentary. He was a Jesuit priest to Akbar's court. There was one line in which he said that when the Begum gave Butzaris to the Portuguese, only then could the ship sail. So I thought to myself, God, where is Butzaris? Now Butzaris is Bulsar. It is 60 miles south of Surat. And it was a new Jagir for Gulbadan. So I had to begin to think, why did she suddenly get the Jagir now? Was this an old allotment? Was this a new allotment? So yes, of course, I mean, they had their own Jagirs and so on and so forth. But in the Akbarnama, this is something because this looks good, but it's also documented. Abul Fazl documents extensively the cash that was sent with women, the kind, in terms of, there were 18,000 dresses of honor for the Sharif of Makkah themselves, right? So it's a very different sense of things.
Of course, she was an imperial person.
She was an imperial person, so obviously she's going with, all this.
The question was really, was that enough for 4 years?
To me,
Murad was supposed to look up to
possibly because the trade routes were on. Or
Yes.
possibly
The way of
the money
sending
was
money.
sent to different domains later too.
deleted things.
Are there any references?
so let me just tell you this, that Murad was responsible for their upkeep. They were guests, imperial guests of Murad. So they were not going to
Okay.
be royal guests and look for food. That's not how it's going to
I'm
happen,
for
right?
To the charity, the abundance that we are talking about.
Yes, that's documented. That's
Yes.
exactly
So
what I
was
was
that
saying.
her money?
took it from his
Yes.
Where did that come from? I was ex-banker, so I don't. For me, question is where's the money?
The question is buy the book later on.
Yes, let's take other questions.
Yeah.
Yes,
I- just in
Azhar and then,
response-
I'm sorry. Yeah.
There's a question here.
So Azhar and then I don't know your name and then you, in that order.
Yeah, I think, thank you for your question, which is provocative and also speaks to us about the biases that we all in this audience bring, deep biases in the way we actually imagine a question. What's fascinating is that you're a banker. And so I might just add that banking as an institution developed in the Netherlands only in the 17th century. The idea of money is actually a very modern industrial concept. Historians start to write about money only in the early 19th century. The way we understand transaction, buying things and financing things is actually a concept that emerges out of industrialization in the 19th century.
I'm sorry, sir, but we're talking about.
But my point is that what you raise actually is a much more interesting question about your work, and that is you cast yourself as a feminist historian, a historian of the text, but I would go further and argue that you're actually, and I say this in a very positive way, a frustrated historical anthropologist. Why? Because you're at the cusp of trying to describe a culture in Gulbadan's terms that maybe none of us in this audience can really capture, really understand, because we weren't living in her moment.
Yes.
And yet you're constantly on the edge. You're
She's assembling,
constantly
yeah.
trying through the word, right? My question, so I'm left with the question, as you methodologically sorted out pictures, words, her words, etc., to what extent did you actually consult, talk to historical anthropologists in figuring out how to
Yes.
develop your narrative? Because you
Yes.
began with the question, what is narrative and how the heck do I
Exactly.
construct one?
Yes.
I'm thinking of Marshall Sahlins,
Yes.
an alternative account
Yeah.
of the discovery of Australia
Yeah. No,
from the
absolutely.
viewpoint of the native.
Absolutely. No, any number of, thank you, that's a lovely intervention. And I think I have never, even while doing Mughal history, people think, the monuments or the texts or the worlds that we delve in are somehow, so the relationship with the past is also this very dry, ossified relationship. Imagining that somehow we can't get it, and not imagining that this actually lives with us, around us, and it lives in such succulent layers, right? Which is why I was saying that for me, I don't like this phrase, but I use it because it captures something. How to think of the sounds and smells in some ways, right? The dryness of the soil, the texture of the terrain, the mahamal, the texture of the clothing. Important things like in the 16th century, women did not wear the ihram, the two-part clothing for the performance of the rites, right? It's only in the 19th century you begin to hear about women and men dressed identically, right? But what does it mean to don, the ihram? So it's been very deeply ethnographically oriented, this work. I mean, that's how it's structured. In a way, it's also challenging the boundaries of the travelogue, because this book was written during COVID. I was in Sweden. I was stranded in Sweden for a year on a lovely fellowship, but I was traveling with this woman, right? I would have wanted to go to each of these places. So texts acquired a tactility, words acquired a tactility, images acquired a tactility in the ways in which I had not imagined that they could. So I think that's a lovely intervention you made, because these were very deeply felt. Ships. I mean, I wanted to think. A lot of this was what I call bullet point history. She took the ship from Surat, and then she spent 4 years, and then she came back. Right? This is all we knew. Majority of the book is about really getting out from Fatehpur Sikri and then what happens. So I wanted to know what were the Jahaz like, right? What was the differences between the Jahaz and the Kishti? And I studied 16th century ships. The first generation Mughal ships were so different. Where did they sit? The front was often like an ootni. How were they decorated, right? What were the textiles? And then when you look, there's riches that come your way. I found one passage in the Akbarnama, actually in a letter of the Mir-e-Hajj, which is, this is now in the British Library, where the Jahaz on which Gulbadan and other women were going, somewhere in the Indian Ocean, a boy fell off the ship, right? And he writes, the Mir-e-Hajj writes this letter to Akbar and says, so it's beautifully detailed. He says that we then lowered the kishtis. It was extremely dark. We lowered the kishti, and we could not light the lamp, because if we lit the lamp, there would be potential danger of burning or sea monsters. So I thought, my God, which sea monsters, right? What are we talking about here? This is not the sci-fi sea monsters, right? And I thought, this is totally reasonable in that mode than to think, when the child was rescued, what happened? What did they say? What was his condition, right? What was happening? So absolutely, I mean, the only thing I could not do, and I would have done it, had the time been right, is to have traveled part of the way myself, right? That was the part that got missing thanks to COVID. So thank you for that lovely question. Sorry, yes, go on.
Good evening, my name is Tazmeen Kareem, and I myself have studied gender studies and feminism at a postgraduate level, so it really struck a chord with me. This is in conjunction to what you were saying earlier on, that the Mughal Empress, they wanted to be seen as generous and kind. So are we saying that Gulbadan, quote unquote, was allowed to perform the Hajj? Because if we are saying that she was allowed, then it kind of reinforces the notion that, this is benevolent, patriarchy, that she may not have actually had that agency. So could you just, elaborate on that?
No, she brings forward the proposal to Akbar.
Okay.
She says for a long time, all this is documented again in the Akbarnama. For a long time, I have wanted to, to go on the Hajj, and I think it is time. In fact, in Surat, when the Kartas is not ready, Akbar sends her a letter. He says that in the letter, he says, the times are tough, and if something dishonorable happens to you, it would be a dishonor for us. So the important thing in the performance of the pilgrimage is the intention, he writes to her. And he says, you've already gone that far, your intention, so you can go back next year. And she says, no, right? That's all we know. So she's extremely proactive in this decision that she makes.
Okay. And there's also, there's another question, in connection to this, that was performing Hajj and performing Hajj for a woman for an extended period of time. was this for them a way to envisage roots of emancipation and liberation? I know
So
it's a
that's
very
also
broad
very
question.
contemporary
Yeah.
terminology,
Yeah.
right?
Probably
This
they
is,
didn't think of
this
it
is
then.
the thing I want to think through, right? This I can use in English, or at least I have allowed myself to use in English, right? What were their senses of freedom?
Yeah.
How do women experience that? And you see, Hajj, this is the important thing. This is why thinking what the Hajj in the 16th century meant was very critical for me, because it was not just about the rites. There was very important, extraordinary itineraries on which people traveled, and I read some of those, right? To Makkah, to Medina, of course for the pilgrimage, but the areas around. There was extensive travel that took place. Observations, wells, gardens, wadis, of all kinds. So it was a very it was a holistic, bodily, emotional, cerebral experience, right? But also what I come quite close to it. As I say, I stand adjacent with it. Being in that soil. So the last part of the book, I didn't want to tell you this, but I will in the context of this question. When Akbar in 1580 finally sends another Mir Hajj to bring them back, and one line in the Akbarnama says the women did not want to come back. Now that's enough for me, right?
Wow.
But when they come back, in the Babul Mandab, in the Red Sea, their ship wrecks, and they stay in Aden, in Yemen for another 7 months. And I chart that whole chapter of where they might have stayed, what it might have happened. So it's extraordinary, right? All of this. Now, one is dumbfounded, right? By that kind of capacity, that kind of endeavor, senses of freedom, exploration, curiosity. It's pretty extraordinary. There was a question here. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. Really amazing. I'm Seher.
What's your name?
Seher. So I wanted to ask, like in one of your earlier papers, you sort of talk about how Gulbadan, she is a historian in her own right. And when she's writing about things, you have other male historians writing about, say, similar events, right? So in one feast, you have a male historian writing about who Akbar is shaking his hands with, or the emperor is interacting with. But for the same feast, you have Gulbadan noting down, these were the musicians who were sitting in the feast, and names them and things like that. So you really mentioned how, as a female historian, she brought in aspects that were usually missed out on.
Yes.
Details about grain, about fabric, about
Yes.
gifts, about
That's
metals,
right.
things like that.
That's
So
right.
when you are writing a memoir and a biography about her, one, do you see yourself reflecting that sort of historicity as a woman? And when you do, what are some of the things that you would pick up from Gulbadan's history that you don't think
Great.
other people would have picked up on?
Yeah, that's lovely. So the deeply this issue of language is very complex. So I would say it's a deeply feminine word, right? Because she opens up that world in the ways in which, I think it's a very profound book in some senses. And so when I don't like these categories that people impose on me as an historian. My practice and my discipline is history. And I think I'm very deeply philosophically invested in how we think about figures. What worlds they inhabit. What do they bring with them? How might we understand? Can we come close to understanding that world, right? So when we put when we put our feet in the shoes of Gulbadan, what does it look like, right? When we stand there, what is the world like? And that doesn't reduce the wider world, right? It adds to that. No, add is bad. Add is supplemental. No, it enriches that world, right? It complicates it, it layers it, it makes it succulent. That's the thing, and I hope I'm doing that in my work, right? When I wrote the Noor book, part of the thing was, of course, I wanted to launch a sovereignty. But that co-sovereignty, a key participant in that co-sovereignty were many, many men,
Yes.
including Jahangir. So it was a rewrite of Jahangir as well, right, in some senses. So to me, as I say in my classes, right, people think gender equals women. It's completely crazy, right? Gender means a set of relationships in which I include the environment, topography, birds, animals, modes of travel, clothing, our food, our demeanor. I mean, if you can capture somebody's demeanor, right? What did she look like? It's a great question. It's not a small question, right? I think of her as very impish, very cerebral. I often think, the last chapter, the books of Gulbadan, I imagined how she might have sat. I mean, we have paintings telling us these moments when women would sit together under the awning, what was happening, how the kissa khani was going on, those sorts of things. So those are of great interest to me. And I think it is through that thinking that I acquire my form. Poorly put. I hope that answers your question.
We'll take one last question from Anu.
Yeah, she piqued my interest a bit when there was the conversation between both of them, and he was saying, only in the 18th century or something, there must have been a form of banking or something.
There was, and there's a lot.
And it's yes, exactly, and it's a very old system that they have, and how that might have facilitated all of this story of yours.
Yeah.
Because I mean, if you look at the empire and you look at what's happening from there to there to there, you have to have some kind of system.
Yeah.
And though it may not be what we see today, there must have been something which is not just trade and barter,
Yeah.
but something which is almost like a Medici banking or whatever we call it.
We had double-entry bank case.
We were saying Havana.
I don't know. I'm not so erudite on this subject, but I'm just saying because you brought up the subject and you said
It did not exist
how do you know that?
because of historical scholarship and fairly deep historical scholarship. I'm an anthropologist of money.
But your knowledge may be incomplete.
Okay, can I?
Precisely. But I can tell you with certitude that banking as an institution, in the terms that we recognize it, does not go back previous to the 18th century Dutch.
Yes, but
Aussie adjacent.
we're talking about that.
Can I? Let me.
Okay, we could ask us.
Okay, so Ruby will respond, and then we will call it a night. Yeah?
As Azhar is saying, it was not institutionalized in the ways in which
Right.
there's a suggestion you're making.
That's right.
There's definitely the mint. You have the mint. There are arrangements about money and coins. After all, there are coins that are issued and so on. As to transporting them, I talk about this in the book. There was masses of security with the soldiers when the cash was transported. And it's not just cash. That's coins and other things. It's also very expensive clothing that's going on. There are other forms of there's sandalwood that's going on. There is
The thing is, this is the boat on which everything floats. The blood of an empire. The blood of an empire runs on many different things.
I'm sorry. I think we are narrowing this down. We are really narrowing this down to something that I don't think I'm doing. I think, bounty, cash, dresses of honor, and many forms of those things are being transported with the women. That's how we know. And the Hajj goes in 1577, but there are other Hajj caravans every year that are going. So more resources could have been sent, but we must not forget that these are also people who are guests of the Ottomans. That's the whole point, right? They want to take over this hospitality, and something else begins to take place.
Thank you. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you.
On that note, Ruby having the last word. Thank you, Uday, for doing this.
Thank you.
You took the time to read the book. And thank you, Ruby, for sharing, as Uday says, 26 years of journey with Gulbadan, and the last 5 years, 6 years of this work. I remember when you were in Sweden, we exchanged a couple of messages, and I messaged you before you went to Sweden, and then we lost touch in Sweden, and then we stayed in touch after that. But yeah, I remember that time. Thank you for sharing it. We all wish you all the best with the book.
Thank you.
We hope it goes places like the protagonist in the book. And I hope it has a great journey.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
We will bring it again.